Has this changed the way you approach other stories?
I think so, a little bit. And I mean, I'm not doing that kind of daily journalism anymore in the same way. Now I'm doing, I left the Star in 2018, so I've gone independent. So now I'm doing more films and podcasts, which are my new favorite medium because it gives you like 3 hours to tell a story. You have somebody captive for that long, so you can really get into the, the nuances of it. But yeah, I think so. I think in sort of small ways. It was interesting when I wrote the piece for the Star, because I also had to correct the record there, came out with this, and our ombud wrote who's a friend of mine, wrote a companion piece with it, and was, critical in some ways, said that maybe I hadn't done the right fact checking. I respect that he had to do the piece, but that I actually disagree with, because I think, one, I mean, good luck fact checking in a war zone when you're riding around with African Union forces and, basically embedded. Like there was just some logistics that you couldn't, and we did our due diligence in other ways. But I also think it's equally important in those situations to have a duty of care for those that you're interviewing. And Ismail was totally traumatized as to what happened to him. So I wouldn't want to become so cynical that I would have, badgered him. Like, are you sure this is what happened? And re-traumatize him in this. Like, there is a real duty of care that you have to have when you're in the field. So I think it's a fine balance. And I mean, those were when the film, part of our discomfort with this film, which was sort of the whole time. But when it came out, we're very thankful that it's actually had a really receptive audience. Every screening we've done has been really thoughtful. Good comments, because our fear coming out was that people we didn't do a good job in explaining it, and people would come away, with xenophobia, or like, well, see, all refugees lie, and see, the media is fake, like, which are the two sort of little racist and ignorant phrases that we hear a lot today. So we certainly didn't want to add to that conversation, but thankfully it hasn't.
Oh, good.
So yeah, or we've had the right people watching the film, maybe.
Nice. I mean, realistically, though, like, is there anything that you think you should have done differently, in 2009?
I think if I looked back in the way I wrote the story, I would have done it a little bit differently. I think just in the language of, as you said, like kind of romanticizing it in a way. I might have just, it was, interestingly enough, he was just the start of a story about what was happening at the time. So it wasn't entirely about him. There was a lot of context, but I think, I think the words you use, how you frame it, I might have done it a little less sensationally in a way. But it's more, I'm not sure. It was more like a thinking in a larger way at how we go at these stories than any kind of specific, like, I definitely should have, I mean, the ironic thing was the only people that were telling the truth at that time was the Shabab. I mean, they had actually said, to put out at that time, they had a press agent who he was very, who often emailed, and he actually said in the email that he had been a thief, and which I put in the story that they said that. But obviously we also know that they did a lot of stories that were just pure propaganda. So
one of the biggest tensions for me watching this was your relationship with Ismail and his relationship to the story. What do you think, as journalists, we owe our sources?
That's a really good question. And some people say, you got close with him. Should you do that? And I guess it's two separate questions. But I do think the longer I've been in journalism, this idea of being objective is just false. There's just absolutely no way you can be objective. We all bring lenses to what we cover. And I think as long as you recognize that, then that's important. I mean, the longer I covered national security, the more of a lens I came, but I think the reporting got better. I mean, it was at some point I'm like, yeah, that's just a lie. I mean, the Pentagon is just saying a lie. I can't give it equal weight to what, someone else is saying. So, but in terms of relationships too, I mean, that was definitely the closest I've ever come to anybody. And I don't think I would do that. If I had a similar scenario, I don't think I would. do that differently. I wasn't forcing a relationship. I mean, anytime I'd go to Norway, I'd see him, and we just had sort of a fun friendship, like an older sister type friendship. I did keep telling his story, but we had a relationship outside of that. Having said that, it made it incredibly complicated. And when we were filming, it was funny, before we knew what he came forward with the truth, we were kind of having trouble with filming because I didn't want to film. I didn't want to I wanted him to look good. I wanted him. I think the cinematographer, who's really great, was probably frustrated with me at times. I'm like, okay, camera on, camera off. I mean, you don't do that in documentaries, right? Like, for that kind of cinema verite, you just kind of roll with it, see where it goes. But I'd be like, are you comfortable? Is it like, there was this real kind of, I wanted him to look really good on I didn't want it to be messy. I wanted him to put his best, foot forward. And he wanted that. So he was kind of performing. Probably some of our best honest moments came when we weren't rolling, so in terms of filmmaking, that was a lesson, but also it's tough when you are close to somebody.
It's something I read, obviously on a very different scale, but like, I still wrestle with, what do I owe someone if they're telling me something that is really valuable, but that might get them in trouble? Do I say something?
Right.
If they want to be identified, but I think being identified might be a bad idea, do they get to choose that? Do I tell them this is a bad idea? If they ask me for help after the story runs, I still wrestle with that. I don't know.
Me too. And sorry, that was more your question. In this case, he wanted the story told, sort of all along the way. He was the one driving. He was the one driving the documentary. So it was a little bit different, but definitely you face that all the time. And I always laugh that I think the longer I did that kind of work or that kind of daily journalism, the worse journalist I became, because I would never promise anyone anything. Like, I'd be like, you can talk to me, probably won't do anything. Like, you might online, you might face this hate. And I really would talk people out of it. They'd be like, no, I actually want to talk to you. Can you shut up and get your recorder going? But I do think, I think there is people don't realize what happens. Like, we realize it because we know what happens. And, we get that barrage too on especially now on social media. But I feel like you really do have that duty to explain to people what it means to put yourself out there. But I mean, ultimately people have to decide. Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, it depends. We're talking about victims. Sometimes there's people that obviously need to be held to account. That's a different scenario. But when it's that kind of situation, I tend to now go, like, I'd rather not have the story and not have someone talk to me than to have them call me, 2 weeks later and be like, I lost my job. That happened. I now have to, move because I'm getting such a barrage of hate.
Does that mean, like, are we responsible for calculating the consequences, do you think? Or is it enough for us to say, this probably won't help you? It could hurt you in these ways. Yeah. I'm turning my recorder on now.
Yeah, I think it's a case by case, but because you can't predict where a story is going to go anyway. I remember when telling Ismail's story, it was at a period where I was starting to burn out a little bit, and especially with the whole, quote unquote war on terror, because it felt like such a fear factory. And I remember thinking, no one's going to care about this. Like, it was so devastating, and I'd seen a lot in various conflicts. And I'd seen a lot, especially in Somali, which tended to be a very misunderstood country, sort of never moved past what people think of like Black Hawk Down and Captain Phillips. So I remember being a bit like, no one's, and then it surprised me that it had, then it went viral. So you never really know, but I think you just do your best to be responsible and just, when you're talking with someone that they don't know the consequences. And I think there's a responsible way to explain it. And ultimately it's up to people whether or not they want to talk.
And then on a personal level, what do you do with that sort of soul killing conviction that you're not going to make a difference?
Sometimes you do. I mean, it's just, it's hard. I mean, a lot of times I miss daily journalism. I certainly, miss the travel and having this front row seat to some incredible periods of history. But I don't miss that part of it. I don't miss the turning on Twitter, firing up your laptop, and you've got 27 people spewing hate at you, before you've had your first coffee, and also now the news cycle goes so fast, right? It's really hard. It used to be easier, because I started with Star in like the 90s, and it used to be easier to make a difference because you had that one big investigation. And it's the only thing anyone would read. Yeah. And now it's like you're lucky if you're, top of the website for a couple hours. So it is harder. But it's still, I mean, we're talking negatively, but it's still really, in a way, it's never mattered more, of course. It's just that the fight to get the sort of truth out there and to get people to respect journalism is harder, but it really matters. And so when you do have those stories that make a difference, and honestly, even if like this, if one person watches the film and thinks a little bit differently about the kind of stories they consume, or I always give the example of, when we had an influx of Syrian refugees here, or Afghan refugees recently, like everyone wanted the photo of like Trudeau kissing the refugee at the airport with a Canadian flag. And you want the story, which is a great story about somebody who's opened the Queen Street West restaurant and is doing really well. You want to celebrate that. But, when you would pitch stories about mental health issues and how tough it is those were harder stories to sell. So but they matter. And so if somebody watches a film like this and thinks, oh, I should really alter my expectations in even the way I consume news, then in a small way, you're making a difference. You're just changing a perception, and that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of response did you get from people like involved with the project, Ismail?
Lovely. We actually filmed with them, and then we couldn't work it into the film. But yeah, because you saw the scene, like when he came to Toronto and he had that moment. So it was just wonderful, actually. When he came back to Toronto, he met many of the leaders, and they're like, we understand. It's fine. You deserved everything you got. So it's been really good. Yeah. And Norway so far hasn't. We did worry at one point. We hired a lawyer to see if it would impact his immigration, and before the film ran, and the advice was no. But you never know with politics and what could happen. But so far, it's all been fine.
Can they do that? Can they take away your citizenship?
Luckily, he was a citizen, but you can. There are cases that it can happen if you lie, but the lie is so small. I mean, he was a refugee and needed protection, but there have been cases, yeah.